And today I bring you two stories, two real stories, one told to me by my grandfather and the other is a story I experienced. And the first story we've titled The Coal Pot. My grandfather met my grandmother when he was 18 years old. My grandmother had 4 other sisters who were of marrying age. My grandmother's eldest sister had already received her father's permission to marry her boyfriend, Domingo. The boyfriend rented a small farm to start their new life. The farm was very close to my grandmother's parents' house, so they could visit each other every night. One of those nights, Domingo approached my grandfather to tell him something. He had been having the same dream for several days. In the dream, a woman appeared in the house they had rented. The woman was very beautiful, with black hair and very fair skin. She wore a transparent gown that revealed her entire body. The woman didn't speak, but with seductive gestures, she invited him to follow her in the dream. He went with the woman, and when they reached a stone fence, she showed him a sack full of bones. She continued walking and then showed him a clay pot full of gold coins. Before he could ask or say anything, the woman disappeared, and he woke up. But what frightened him the most was that the night before he spoke to my grandfather, he had the same dream. However, when he woke up, he wasn't in bed, he was standing at the door of the house, looking towards the place where the woman had pointed. In the distance, he saw a phosphorescent green light emerging from between the stones. Then the light rose until it disappeared. Domingo was truly scared. My grandfather wasn't very superstitious, despite experiencing many paranormal things over his 95 years. So, he suggested they investigate. Another of the future brothers-in-law overheard part of their conversation and approached them. "I want to go with you too," Pedro requested. "I'll help you move the stones." My grandfather and Domingo agreed to let him come, but on the condition that he wouldn't tell anyone. Pedro accepted the condition, and they agreed to go the next night. The next day, after saying goodbye to their respective girlfriends, Pedro and my grandfather went to Domingo's farm, where he was anxiously waiting for them. They walked to the end of the farm where the beautiful girl had marked. As they walked through the banana grove, a strong wind suddenly began, followed by distant barking of dogs and neighing of horses. It sounded like a hunt. They heard the sound of horse hooves right next to them, but they couldn't see anything. In the distance, under the moonlight, they saw figures resembling chained men. Panic seized Domingo and Pedro, who clung to my grandfather like 2 children. "Let's get out of here, the devil is loose," they shouted. Domingo and Pedro ran back to the house, leaving my grandfather alone. After the other 2 locked themselves in the house, my grandfather said that everything calmed down. He thought about continuing and searching, but Domingo didn't tell him the exact location, so he had to return to Domingo's house. There, he found the 2 of them armed with machetes. What was that? That was not of this world, they asked my grandfather, frightened. My grandfather shrugged and went home. Pedro was still shaken, so he asked Domingo if he could sleep at his house that night. For several days, my grandfather didn't see Domingo and Pedro. They avoided talking about that incident at all costs. Finally, they reunited at a family baptism. Domingo approached my grandfather and confessed that those dreams hadn't stopped. Every night, he returned to the girl marking those 2 places. My grandfather suggested the idea that perhaps the girl was asking them to remove those bones and give Christian burial in exchange for that pot of gold. Domingo thought about it and nodded, accepting that suggestion as a possibility. After a moment of reflection, he finally decided to ask the question my grandfather was already expecting. "Are you willing to accompany me? We can split the money or whatever is there." My grandfather agreed once again, more out of curiosity than the possibility of gaining something. Again, that night, they ventured to the end of the farm where the stone fence was. As they approached, a strong wind started again. The trees shook, and banana plants seemed like they were about to be ripped from the ground. Once again, there were screams as if they were being chased by dogs. And once again, Domingo panicked and ran away. This time, my grandfather continued towards the stone fence and dug where Domingo had indicated. Indeed, there, he found a sack of bones. After making the gruesome discovery, they reported it to the rural guard. The next morning, they took the bones to a forensic expert who determined that those bones were easily over 100 years old and couldn't be identified. My grandfather was the best friend of the rural guard's corporal, and when the investigation concluded, my grandfather and the corporal went to Manco's bar for a drink. In such a small town, everyone already knew about the discovery. In the bar, Manco, the owner, mentioned that there was a legend that said those lands had belonged to a landowner who had a sugar cane plantation during the time of slavery. They say he had a very beautiful but rebellious daughter. The girl fell in love with a mulatto, and the father vehemently opposed any kind of union. They say the girl stole a considerable amount of money from her father, but he never suspected her. The father blamed the slave women working in the house. So, the landowner had all the slave women whipped, but they didn't confess, they knew nothing. Faced with unsatisfactory answers from the women, the landowner threatened to kill them all, and in front of everyone, he murdered the oldest slave. That slave had been the nanny of his daughter and knew perfectly well that it was the daughter who had stolen the money, but out of loyalty, she didn't expose the girl. Faced with the horrific scene, some of the slaves began to protest, and to prevent a rebellion, the landowner left things as they were. The girl, horrified at having seen her father kill the woman who had raised her, escaped from the house. They say she was wearing only a thin nightgown and was on her way to her lover's house to escape together. They would return later to retrieve the money. But the father followed her and caught her with her lover, and in a fit of rage, he killed her, and the overseer took care of ending the boy's life. The boy's body was found at the church doors, but the girl's body was never found. The landowner reported his daughter as missing and never spoke of the matter again. They say that after all that, the overseer found the money the girl had stolen from her father and left the town. Others say that the money is still buried on the property. My grandfather finished his drink and went straight to talk to Domingo. After telling Domingo what they had been told, Domingo took my grandfather to the place where the money was supposedly buried. My grandfather reminded Domingo that the eyes of the town were on that farm, and it would be better to wait until nightfall. And so they did. That very night, under the moonlight, they headed to the spot where Domingo had been pointed by the apparition. There, they dug until the shovel hit something hard. Their hearts raced. They put the shovel aside and, with their hands, continued digging. Indeed, there was a covered clay pot. Immediately, they broke the lid to find only pieces of coal inside. The ignorance of those treasure hunters led them to violate one of the most important rules when a deceased person entrusts you with money or a pot, as some people know it. Only the person to whom it was entrusted can unearth the money. If the beneficiary is accompanied or sends someone else or violates any of the conditions, the money turns into coal. And the second story for today we've titled, Ruben's Diploma. Ruben was a great friend who passed away at an early age. Since childhood, he had always been very frail, but he was a great person. He had an older brother, Alexis, who took care of him a lot, and they were inseparable. Ruben grew up and became an excellent student. When he was about to enter university, his mom was diagnosed with a serious illness. So, Ruben took a one-year hiatus from university to accompany his mom while his brother and father worked. His mom's illness only lasted for 7 months. On the day she passed away, she got up early and, although very weak, wanted to prepare breakfast for her son Ruben as always. Ruben never took his eyes off her, fearing that she might fall and hurt herself. But that day, he left her alone for a moment, just a few seconds to use the bathroom. Suddenly, he heard a crash coming from the kitchen. When he ran back to his mother, she was already unconscious. He called for help, but by the time they arrived, she had already died. That was the first loss he experienced in his life and was the loss of the most important person to him. The loss of his mother haunted him for the rest of his years. After his mother's death, his father decided that they would all move to Grandma's house. After Ruben recovered, he returned to his studies and started an engineering degree. He loved his field of study. Many times he explained things related to computer parts, algorithms, and other things that were incomprehensible to my 10 or 12-year-old mind. One morning, while showering to go to university, he felt a lump in his throat, but he didn't pay much attention to it. Days later, he noticed that it was still growing and noticed 2 more on one side. Immediately, he went to the doctor to receive the sad and frightening news that he had the same illness as his mother. Treatments, chemotherapy, surgeries started immediately, but nothing helped. During that time, he never stopped studying. Friends came and brought him class notes, explained new subjects, and introduced new concepts that were being introduced in the classes. On days he felt unwell, he locked himself in his room and refused to see his friends. He asked his father to please pick up the notes and thanked the guys. Finally, the long-awaited graduation day arrived. He could barely stand, but Alexis managed to get a wheelchair and took him to the event. At the moment of receiving the diploma, the father and Alexis stood, one on each side, and were his support to collect the fruit of his efforts. That day, he even took a few sips of beer to celebrate that event. Unfortunately, the next day, he fell into a coma and never woke up. All his university classmates, professors, even the dean attended his funeral. As expected, everyone was devastated, especially his brother Alexis, who had recently lost his mother and now lost his brother, so the father quickly decided to get rid of all the medical equipment, the hospital bed, and everything that reminded him of the painful event. The clothes, books, and other belongings were locked in a closet in one of the rooms of the house. A few months passed, and everything seemed to be normalizing until one afternoon when Grandma was preparing food. She heard moans, thinking it was one of the granddaughters playing a joke, but it wasn't. The girls were playing in the garden. She thought it might have been an insignificant noise and forgot about it. A few minutes later, she began to hear loud crying. Again, worried, Grandma ran out, thinking something had happened to the girls. But she was absolutely alone in the house. After all this, she calmed down, and Grandma decided not to say anything to avoid scaring the family. They might think she was crazy. That Sunday, after a long time, the family gathered for lunch at Grandma's house. They had just sat down at the table when the sound of inconsolable crying filled the space. Everyone went out to see what was happening, searched the entire house, but no one saw anything. They tried to give 1,000 explanations. Perhaps it was a power outage in the radio or the television. Maybe some of the children playing passed by the street making noises. And although that event left everyone uneasy, no one touched the subject again. The next day, the grandmother, Ruben's father, and Alexis were having dinner. And again, those chilling sobs. Although that family was an atheist family, they knew that something was happening. That crying became an everyday occurrence, always at lunch or dinner time. Another Sunday when the family was gathered, ready to have lunch, the crying was heard again. Unexpectedly, a black bird entered the house and landed on the table. Confused, the bird stumbled over the plates, with food trays, ruining lunch. That had no logical explanation. Something was definitely happening. The wife of one of Ruben's uncles was a believer and visited a spiritualist. When the lady began the ceremony, Ruben's spirit said, "If my father and my brother are not here, I won't speak." Ruben's uncle's wife tried to talk to the father and Alexis. The brother was open to going to the spiritualist, but the father always saw those people as lying charlatans, taking advantage. But in the meantime, the noises, crying, and other paranormal events didn't stop. One night, Ruben's father was alone in the house watching television when a crash shook him. The noise came from the room where the closet with Ruben's things was. So the father went to investigate immediately. There he found all the contents of the closet on the floor scattered around the room. Seeing his son's things, great sadness overcame him, and he cried for hours until Alexis arrived. The son convinced him that they should finally go see the spiritualist. They had nothing to lose. When they arrived at the spiritualist's house, she began to prepare the items used in these activities. When the lady shook herself, her fine voice turned into a deep voice, and between sobs, she said, "Put my diploma for everyone to see. I love you." And with that, the spirit left. Ruben's father framed the diploma for everyone to see. "I love you." And with that, the spirit left. Ruben's father framed the diploma and placed it in the living room. From that day to the present, all paranormal events ceased.